Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Federalist Read Along, Federalist number 29. If this is your first time here, what we are about to do is go line by line through a Federalist paper. This week it's number 29, as aforementioned. And we're going to dissect that 18th century language to see if we can't learn a little bit about what the American founders were thinking when they created the United States Constitution. Yes, that very Constitution. That being said, thank you for joining me. I know I'm going up against the State of the Union, which in hindsight might not be the best idea, but I like to save things that might get my blood pressure up for the next day. But we do our best not to talk about modern politics on this channel. Alex, thank you for joining us. This is a live video if you're watching in the future, so I'm thanking Alex for saying let's go and being pumped to learn about the American Revolution. Without further ado, I am going to pop up the big board over here. As we do, I will say, I have recovered from COVID, as many of you know, and my haircut that has been delayed next week will be cut. I won't look so disheveled, I assure you. Let's get on over here to the read-along. We are looking at Federalist number 29. A few interesting things about this particular Federalist. This actually was written later. The date, as you see in front of you, is January 10th. We jumped from December 26th, I believe it was, all the way up to January 10th. And then next week we go back in time because these were published originally a little bit out of order, but the order of the Federalist Papers, this one given number 29, they didn't actually get numbers until they were first published in book form the following March of 1788. And when they were published in book form, this one got moved up the line a little bit. So we are going in the order that they were published in book form, the order that they are numbered generally by historians, as opposed to a little bit out of order as they were originally published. Another interesting note about this one is this is published in the Daily Advertiser. Up until right now, every Federalist paper had actually been published basically one for one between the Independent, the New York Journal and the Independent Examiner, I believe, are the two papers that we published. That's what they've been published in up until now, but now the Daily Advertiser gets to hang out. This one is Alexander Hamilton, and this is a one-off concerning the militia. Now, the Americans were... Troy, history is generally messy. Thank you so much for coming. We had been talking a lot about standing armies and why Hamilton thought we very much needed standing armies. This one talks about concerning the militia. The Anti-Federalist had been making a lot of claims about the militia, and hey, why does the federal government get to take our militia? Shouldn't we be able to use that militia if the federal government comes at us? If I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've read this one, but I believe he also discusses the idea of posse comitatus in this, which is literally calling out the posse. And at least one, I believe it was the Federal Farmer, is the one Anti-Federalist who really at this time was kind of yelling about posse comitatus. Why can the federal government call out the state militias, but the local sheriff can't call out the posse? Which I know when we hear call out the posse, we usually think cowboys out in the Wild West, but it was a long-standing tradition well before the Wild West was being claimed, as they say. Without further ado, now that we've done a little more background than we generally do, let's get to reading the actual paper. As always, to the people of the state of New York, because that's who we were trying to convince to support the Constitution, the power of regulating the militia and of commanding its services in times of insurrection and invasion are natural incidents to the duties of superintending the common defense and of watching over the internal peace of the Confederacy. So he's admitting here that the militia is very important both to protect the states from internal revolt and from foreign powers coming in from the outside. They are natural in superintending the common defense. It is perfectly reasonable for us to have that and to keep the peace of the Confederacy. So he's acknowledging it's not only good at the state level for the individual states, but it's good for maintaining the peace of the Confederacy. And that's going to come in important because he's going to be talking about the larger Confederacy, as he is wont to do. It requires no skill in the science of war to discern that uniformity in the organization and discipline of the militia would be attended with the most beneficial effects wherever they were called into service for the public defense. So you don't need to be a military expert to understand that a strong militia is very good for a variety of reasons. At least at the time, we don't really have them. There are some places with militias, but at large, we don't really have them anymore, of course. It would enable them to discharge the duties of the camp and of the field with mutual intelligence and concert, an advantage of peculiar moment in the operations of an army, and it would fit them much sooner to acquire the degree of proficiency in military functions which would be essential to their usefulness. So he's quickly referencing that should they be able to work together in a certain fashion, that the separate militias coming together, and actually, to be fair, to clarify, within each state there were separate militias. Each county generally had a militia. That's a gross generalization across all of the states, obviously, but generally speaking, each individual county had their own militia, and they would be called together at the state level to work together. And it's important to have these separate militias to protect the whole, work together when necessary. This desirable uniformity can only be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. There it is. If we really want these militias to work together appropriately, well, we need a constitution so they can all work together from the northernmost of Maine through the southernmost of Georgia at the time. It is therefore, and these are his capitals, not mine, I will remind you, it is, therefore, with the most evident propriety that the plan of the convention proposed to empower the Union, quote, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So he is quoting the Constitution here. The Constitution does not capitalize those words, if memory serves. He is doing it for us. That being said, he's putting up front what many of the Anti-Federalists are critiquing. This is the part they are critiquing, that the idea that the federal government could actually control the militias. Now, what he's capitalizing here is the idea that, yes, the Union, the national government, will be able to call in the militias and will have certain parts of control, but the states get to appoint their officers, so the men are actually being led by officers from their own states, and they are the ones who are responsible for training the militias. Now, granted, there is that last line, according to the discipline prescribed by Congress, so they are not just following state militia rules. Now, suddenly, the state militias, they can do it all by themselves, but they have to do it under the Congress's direction, which is a gigantic change from what they were accustomed to at the time. Pick this up so I'm not staring down. They're right in front of my face. That's better. Of the different grounds which have been taken in opposition to the plan of the convention, there is none that was so little to have been expected or so untenable in itself as the one from which this particular provision has been attacked. So, of all these anti-federalist arguments being thrown at me, this one is the one I expected the least. He does say that on various occasions. Oh, Hamilton. But he's essentially saying, I can't believe that there's so much hostility to having these separate militias be united for a common cause. Again, just to note, many of the Anti-Federalists at the time were, first of all, what if the federal government's being banned and we need to protect ourselves from the federal government? That's why we need a state militia. And what if there is a civil war, which would, my voice keeps cracking today, a civil war which would unite 80 years after this, less than 80 years after this, 70 years after this. What if we have to fight one of our neighboring states, or as they might put it, protect ourselves from one of our aggressive neighboring states? Which Hamilton doesn't see that coming, apparently. If a well-regulated militia be the most natural defense of a free country, it ought certainly to be under the regulation and at the disposal of that body which is constituted the guardian of national security. So, if we have these militias to protect ourselves from either internal revolt or external invasion, why wouldn't we use this constitution that you're clearly going to ratify to unite these bodies to fight together? Excuse me. Okay, let's see. If standing armies are dangerous to liberty, an efficacious power over the militia in the body to whose care the protection of the state is committed ought, as far as possible, to take away the inducement and the pretext to such unfriendly institutions. So he's acknowledging here that standing armies, as he's argued in many previous papers, the last 5 or 6 papers talking about standing armies, if the Anti-Federalists are so afraid of a standing army, well, why wouldn't they want the militias to be able to come together and protect themselves from that army? It's a little bit of a backward logic here because, well, it's the same people controlling the army that would control those militias. But it's their job to protect from unfriendly institutions. So if the standing army is unfriendly, why don't you want the militia to defend you from an unfriendly standing army? It's a little bit twisted logic. If the federal government can command the aid of the militia in those emergencies which call for the military arm in support of the civil magistrate, it can the better dispense with the employment of a different kind of force. So here, in addition to what I was just saying, he's also essentially arguing that, hey, if we have control of the militia, if the federal government can take control of the militias, well, we won't have to have such a big standing army that you guys are so afraid of in the first place. We can just more further rely on the militias. But you have to let us call the militia in if you want us to use that instead of the standing army. If it cannot avail itself of the former, it will be obliged to recruit the latter. So again, if we can't get a standing army, we need to call in the militia. To render an army unnecessary will be a more certain method of preventing its existence than 1,000 prohibitions on paper. So if you guys are so afraid of a standing army, the best thing we can do is make it so we don't need one. If you really want to rely on the militias, well, we need to have really good militias that are well trained and all understand the same chain of command. And if an emergency comes together where we need to call together all the separate states to help each other in one united fight, we need all these militias, if they're going to replace the standing army, to be trained well enough and knowledgeable, as I said, in the chain of command and strategic maneuvering that a standing army would have. If we're going to replace standing army, the militia needs to be able to actually do that. So essentially he's saying everyone who's against the standing army, all the anti-federalists against the standing army, should be really for the Constitution, the Union, being able to call in the state militias. Okay, again, caps locks. The capital words are his, not mine. In order to cast an odium upon the power of calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, it has been remarked that there is nowhere any provision in the proposed Constitution for calling out the posse comitatus to assist the magistrate in the execution of his duty, whence it has been inferred that military force was intended to be his only auxiliary. So just to clarify, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the posse comitatus is calling in the posse. At a time when there was no police, you would have an elected sheriff. And if that sheriff needed to enforce the laws, they would call in the posse. This is back before the Wild West. This is how it happened, not only in revolutionary America, but in colonial America, over in Great Britain for presumably centuries. I don't have that thorough a knowledge of the history of posse comitatus laws in Great Britain, but that is what he's saying here. I believe it was Federal Farmer is the Anti-Federalist who makes a big deal about this. And he's saying, why doesn't the Constitution have the ability to call, doesn't give the individual the ability to do that? Okay, so what is his answer to that grievance? There is a striking incoherence in the objections which have appeared, and sometimes even from the same quarter, not much calculated to inspire a very favorable opinion of the sincerity or fair dealing of the author. So he's saying the people who ask, why is there nothing in the Constitution saying that sheriffs can call out the posse, those are bad questions. The people asking those questions, they're being hypocrites. We are going to see why he says that. I do want to go back real quick though. the argument for posse comitatus was if the federal government can call in the state militias, at a time when there was no police force, the militia were the police force. And the militia were the citizens. So if the sheriff needed to arrest someone, they would go get other citizens who had been thoroughly trained with the local militia to assist in carrying out the laws of justice, or the pursuit of justice. That being said, Hamilton thinks the people making this argument are hypocrites, and here's why. The same persons who tell us in one breath that the powers of the federal government will be despotic and unlimited inform us in the next that it has not authority sufficient even to call out the posse comitatus. So, the federal government, what's being said here is the Anti-Federalists, according to Hamilton, are saying the national government is going to be way too powerful, way too powerful. Hold on, wait a minute. It can't even call out a local posse. Now, this is a little bit of a distortion of the actual argument around the posse comitatus Anti-Federalist stance at the time. The Anti-Federalists were saying, why doesn't the Constitution say a local sheriff can call out the militia? Why does it say the federal government can take our state militia, our soldiers, our citizen soldiers, can be called out by the national government, but the local sheriff that those citizen soldiers voted on to enforce their laws, the Constitution says nothing about them being able to call it out. He's turning that around a little bit. Again, as always, I know people don't like when I say this, but this is propaganda. The Federalist Papers were intentional political pamphlets trying to sway public opinion to support the Constitution. And Hamilton was not above distorting his opponent's ideas. And that's exactly what's happening here. He's just taking what they said, tweaking it a little bit to make them look stupid so he could carry out his own argument, when that's really not what they were arguing. The latter, fortunately, is as much short of the truth as the former exceeds it. So that's short of the truth. He's alluding to that, well, no, the federal government can call out the posse. And no, the federal government will not be too despotic and too big. Don't worry about it. Look over there. Now, here it is. And he's capitalizing a certain common phrase in American politics, or constitutional theory. It would be easy for me to say, it would be as absurd to doubt that a right to pass all laws necessary and proper to execute its declared powers would include that of requiring the assistance of the citizens to the officers who may be entrusted with the execution of those laws, as it would be to believe that a right to enact laws necessary and proper for the imposition and collection of taxes would involve that of varying the rules of descent and of the alienation of landed property, or of abolishing the trial by jury in cases related to it. That is a mouthful. Let's break it down. So, everything in this sentence is absurd to doubt. So, if you don't agree with this, you're crazy. A right to pass all laws necessary and proper, requiring the assistance of the citizens to execute those laws. So, the Constitution has the necessary and proper clause, and we haven't heard the Federalist Papers talk about that too much. The Anti-Federalists talk about it a lot. What do you mean you can do anything necessary and proper? It literally means that the federal government can do anything it wants as long as it makes a justifiable reason that it's necessary and proper. But if the Constitution gives the federal government the power to do anything necessary and proper, then what he's saying here is, then that includes being able to call out the posse. If we deem that to execute the laws we need to have a local sheriff call out the posse, sounds necessary and proper, so we can do it. As it is to believe that trial by jury is like its own separate thing, as it would be to believe that to enact laws necessary and proper for the imposition and collection of taxes would be involved that of the varying rules of descent. So, okay, so what we were just saying is, do anything necessary and proper, we can call in the local sheriff to help us with that. But why would we need to enact laws at such a minute level? It wouldn't be necessary or proper, essentially, is what he's saying. And he's also noting here that we're not going to change local tax laws and the alienation of landed property. We don't want our wealthy elites to be mad at us by coming in and messing with them at a very personal level. Or of abolishing trial by jury in cases relating to it. That's a very weird thing to throw in there. He's essentially acknowledging that the federal government could abolish trials by jury at the very local level when it comes to collecting village taxes, but why would we want to? Interesting. Continuing, it being therefore evident that the supposition of a want of power to require the aid of the posse comitatus is entirely destitute of color, it will follow that the conclusion which has been drawn from it in its application of the authority of the federal government, over the militia, is as uncandid as it is illogical. So, again, he's more or less repeating here that, yeah, sure, we could call in the posse under the Constitution. We don't have to write that down. We already wrote necessary and proper. It means we can do anything. As Hamilton mentioned before, we need to be able to do anything whatsoever, especially when it comes to raising an army. So that includes the posse comitatus. That means we can call out very particular local militias under the Constitution. And to say that the government shouldn't be able to do that is uncandid and illogical. Again, the argument the Anti-Federalists were making, especially Federal Farmer, was we want you to write in the Constitution that we, the local sheriffs, have the power to call out this militia that you also think you have the ability to call out. We want the control of our citizen soldiers. What reason could there be to infer that force was intended to be the sole instrument of authority, merely because there is a power to make use of it when necessary? So, just because we have the power to use force, why would we just do it? Is that what he's saying here? That's a crazy thing to say. What reason could there be to infer that force was intended to be the sole instrument of authority merely because there is a power? So, this kind of goes back to what a lot of Anti-Federalists say. He's kind of echoing Anti-Federalist sentiment here when he says the Anti-Federalists would say there are two ways to govern. Force, aka coercion, you will obey our laws or we will put you in prison, or voluntary enforcement, where the people say, good laws, government, you're doing a great job, we're going to follow these laws because we like them. The Anti-Federalists were saying we definitely need to make laws that people want to follow, and we want to avoid at all costs forcing people to obey the laws. Every Anti-Federalist would admit sometimes people commit heinous crimes for no reason, and they should be imprisoned. Obviously, no one's arguing against that then or now, I would presume, except those people, I guess, certain high crimes. But at large, that's what he's referencing here. Why would we need to use force when we could have people want to obey the laws? That is really one of the main Anti-Federalist arguments against the standing army. But they agree there. Isn't it nice when they agree? What shall we think of the motives which could induce men of sense to reason in this manner? So, how men of sense? Why no smart people would think of that. How shall we prevent a conflict between charity and judgment? I don't even know. That sentence is kind of just Hamilton using his fancy speak to get you on his side. Why would there be a conflict between charity and judgment? And what does that have to do with anything at all? Okay, continuing on. Sorry, Hammy, I'm not digging into that one. It's not worth it. We're here for the good stuff. By a curious refinement upon the spirit of Republican jealousy, we are even taught to apprehend danger from the militia itself in the hands of the federal government. So here he's going to get into the real bread and butter of what the Anti-Federalists were arguing. Republican jealousy means he doesn't actually mean jealousy. He means we're very guarded, at the time at least, of our Republican spirit. The American Revolution was fought on Republican ideals, an experiment in liberty. That's the type of jealousy he's discussing there. The not being jealous of your rights, but being protective of your rights in a Republican society. But he's noting here that people are so scared of their freedoms that they are even afraid of the militia itself in the hands of the federal government, of course. And this is what the core of the paper is going to be. Many anti-federalists, yes, said, why do you get to take the militia? That's our way to protect ourselves from you. It is observed that select corps may be formed composed of the young and ardent who may be rendered subservient to the views of arbitrary power. Interesting. So it is observed, so some of the anti-federalists are saying that some of the local militias are going to be young men who want to prove themselves and get ahead. It's why many people, like Hamilton, joined armies in the first place. Then and now, join armies in the first place. It is a good way to improve yourself and get ahead in society and make a name to your peers on who you might be. But they might be rendered subservient to the views of arbitrary power. So they might be so eager to prove themselves to their unit that they don't really care what the orders are. They are just excited to follow the orders, again, to prove themselves very reasonably. But some people are afraid that if they are very good at just following the orders, and arbitrary power is what they used to say dictatorship at the time. The opposite of a free government is an arbitrary government in the excuse me, Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. So they might just listen to a dictator because they just want to do a good job. What plan for the regulation of the militia may be pursued by the national government, it is impossible to be foreseen. So what the federal government will do with its ability to control the state militias, we'll never know until it happens. But so far from viewing the matter in the same light with those who object to select corps as dangerous, were the Constitution ratified, and were I to deliver my sentiments to a member of the federal legislature from this state on the subject of military establishment, I should hold him in substance to the following discourse. Okay, so he's going to give us a little bit of an I forget the phrase, not analogy, allegory, I believe, is about to happen. I think that's the word for it. And that's what he's saying here. So if I were to talk to someone who thinks that these select corps are dangerous, this is what we'll discuss. I do want to note, before we move on to that, though, he is, a lot of what he's saying about the state militias, he's kind of ignoring that the same arguments are being made against a standing army. He had spoken, as we've said, in the last several papers, Hamilton has discussed a standing army and how dangerous, or not dangerous, it's going to be to the people. But right now, he's making an argument as to why young men who want to prove themselves as soldiers in the militia are not dangerous. This same argument should probably have been used when he was discussing the standing army itself. We'll see how much it reflects what he said. So, this is his little allegory here. Let's see how it goes. Again, this is Hamilton talking to essentially an anti-federalist who's afraid that the militias under the control of the government are going to lose control because ambitious young men who've joined those forces. The project of disciplining all the militia of the United States is as futile as it would be injurious if it were capable of being carried into execution. So the idea that you could actually train all of the militia in the United States is itself impossible. Never going to happen. A tolerable expertness in military movements is a business that requires time and practice. So to get really good at military strategy, you need time and practice. It is not a day or even a week that will suffice to the attainment of it. So he's referencing here that, again, the militias were citizens who had jobs and families and things to do. They weren't soldiers, was not their job. This was I don't want to say a hobby, but a part-time endeavor that was kind of looked at as something able-bodied citizens were supposed to do. But they only trained a few weeks a year. It's similar to the National Guard in a fashion, I think. Am I saying that right? If it's the National Guard, yeah, okay. I don't know why I doubted myself there. I really am being cautious. I don't want to offend anyone in any of the armed forces by using the wrong terminology, as I've never served myself. To oblige the great body of the yeomanry and of the other classes of the citizens to be under arms for the purpose of going through military exercises and evolutions, as often as might be necessary to acquire the degree of perfection which would entitle them to the character of a well-regulated militia, would be a real grievance to the people and a serious public inconvenience and loss. So essentially here, the idea that we're going to take people away from their jobs is going to be very difficult for them. It's going to destroy the economy because no one's going to be working as much as they should be, passing around money. And we know how Allie Hams loves his money. And it's a serious inconvenience and loss for the public in general. So we're never going to be able to take the state militia and turn them into what we really would need as a major fighting force. Again, using it as a sly backhand to his previous papers as to why a standing army would be more important than calling in the state militias. Don't be afraid of us using the state militias. This is why we need a standing army anyway. But if we wanted to use the state militias, we could, but we shouldn't have to because they're not going to be good at it anyway. It would form an annual deduction from the productive labor of the country to an amount which, calculating upon the present numbers of the people, would not fall far short of the whole expense of the civil establishments of all the states. So, because again, what I was essentially, I kind of got ahead of him here. Basically, we're going to have to take so much money out of the economy, not to get too far off topic, but you put currencies into circulation so they circulate. That's how a free market economy is generally supposed to work. And if people aren't working and aren't spending money, then the economy itself is going to slow down, especially when the present numbers of people, so like a million people probably at the time out of the 2.5, 3 million people that were alive when he was writing this in North America, it would be very bad. Wilbur, I do see your comment there. I'll get to it right at the end of this paragraph. Thank you for coming. To attempt a thing which would abridge the mass of labor and industry to so considerable an extent would be unwise, and the experiment, if made, could not succeed because it would not long be endured. So it just, again, labor and industry. We can't rely on we're never going to get the militia to suppress the people of the United States. They're just not going to be good at it. Little more can reasonably be aimed at with respect to the people at large than to have them properly armed and equipped. In order to see that this be not neglected, it will be necessary to assemble them once or twice over the course of the year. So we're only going to need to get them together to train for defense purposes once or twice a year. So they know how to use the weapon, they know how to fall in line, and they know how to follow the army if they have to, essentially, is what he's saying here. Let's see. Excuse me. I'm just going to get through this quote, Wilbur, before I get over to your comment. Thank you for being patient. But through the scheme of disciplining the whole nation must be abandoned as mischievous or impractical. Yet it is a matter of the utmost importance that a well-digested plan should, as soon as possible, be adopted for the proper establishment of the militia. So, even though they're never going to be a great fighting force, we should get together on some things. Be prepared if we need them, and if they need to work together, from without or from within, right? The attention of the government ought particularly to be directed to the formation of a select corps of moderate extent, upon such principles as will really fit them for service in case of need. The attention of the government ought to be directed to the formation. Okay, so he's getting back to select corps, higher ranking units of militia that we can expect to behave more along the lines of a standing army, and at the same time be able to bring in the regular militia units in case there's the need arises. Sometimes it might happen. By thus circumscribing the plan, it will be possible to have an excellent body of well-trained militia ready to take the field whenever the defense of the state shall require it. So because if we have this plan in place, if and when we need it, we'll be able to go. This is like the 5th time he's used the phrase well-trained militia, which is part of the Second Amendment that's often forgotten to be mentioned, and a really important part. To be fair, we'll save it for when we get there next year. And it's the last Federalist paper. Hamilton actually addresses the need for a Bill of Rights, and he's against it, but there's a reason that this is the language that 2 years later would end up in the Bill of Rights. They were very concerned about training the militia. So a lot of what Hamilton's saying here would speak to the people at the time. Everyone agreed you needed a militia. That was not in question. The standing army, sure, may have been in question. A well-trained militia was not in question, and the training part was really important. And that's why he's saying here, he's trying to say that, look, the federal government will probably be able to train these militias better than the states. Again, many anti-federalists would wholeheartedly disagree with that, but many people sitting on the border of whether or not to support this new government, this is an important argument for them to hear. This will not only lessen the call for military establishments, but if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of the fellow citizens. So, what he's saying here is if we do have a standing army and you're afraid of a standing army, well, you better have a militia ready to defend against that standing army. As I was just saying, the Second Amendment, I'm not going to argue why they grant, it's the right to bear arms, obviously. I'm not necessarily saying it is only for a well-regulated militia. I'll leave that up to you for now. But a well-regulated militia, it was a very important reason for the right to bear arms. And even Hamilton is acknowledging here that having the militia is a good reason for the states to stand up against any federal army, any standing army that he himself wants to raise. He's making the argument, though, that the federal government, only the federal government can unite these separate state militias to a degree where they could actually compete against the national army were they to meet in the field. Again, he also was saying the federal government should have the power to control the state militias, so why the federal government would send its standing army against its own militias doesn't make a lot of sense, but he's putting it out there. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it if it should exist. So this is a fair argument that the militias are the only substitute for a standing army. And that's what a lot of anti-federalists were saying, is we don't need a standing army, we got the militias. That being said, so we got through his little allegory there. I'm going to take a sip of water and respond to some of these comments real quick. Wilbur, it is said, a sense of the current service members have become, I see you're joking about it. I'm not going to address that. The service members I know personally are not very, I don't want to say they're not sensitive. That's not, I mean, I have, some at my wedding and they were all teary-eyed. I don't know what. No, I am not going to touch that with a 20-foot pole. Yellow, what does well-regulated mean in the late 1800s, late 1700s, about to turn 1800 when Jefferson becomes president? But I'm just kidding. It's not an important detail. Well-regulated, from my understanding, essentially means well-trained, disciplined. You would go to the field. And not only did each state have different ways of regulating their militias, but each county, each town, the militias would pop up as towns were founded over the previous 250 years as people started moving, Europeans started moving to North America. Finding reasons, having Native Americans to fight. You could have a random ship from another country pull into your harbor, and then centuries later, it's essentially boot camp, I guess would be the best way to put it. If you joined the army now, or any branch of the military now, you would go to boot camp, or training to get initiated in, and that training would be you'd be regulated. Back then, a standing army were regular soldiers. The British redcoats, they were referred to by politicians, and they would have called themselves a regular, as opposed to the Americans who were mostly militiamen. And the Continental Army, who were like trying to be regular troops, which after von Steuben showed up, they did better at. But essentially, that's what they mean by well-regulated. Drilled, not only trained to be at least a part-time soldier, but you continue with your trainings regularly, at least for 2 weeks a year or something of that nature, to be prepared. Nowadays, we don't have militias. You and me, if we got the call, hey, I live in a town outside Syracuse, New York, and if they said, hey, Syracuse formed a militia and they're coming to take over our little village, I mean, I live in the woods. We might be pretty good at it. But to me, most people would not necessarily be ready to just pick up a gun. And, it's one thing to pick up a gun and shoot at people. It's another thing to pick up a gun, get in formation, find your location, follow your strategy. Like I said, I've never actually been in the armed forces, but there's a whole slew of things you do when you're in the armed forces that you have to prepare for ahead of time. So, was this reading for arguing or against the adoption of the Second Amendment? I'm sorry, I got listening late. Oh, I'm sorry, Wilbur. We are reading Federalist number 29. These are the words of Alexander Hamilton promoting the United States Constitution and defending the federal government's ability to control state militias. So it's not actually for or against the Second Amendment yet. The Second Amendment Hamilton wouldn't address the Bill of Rights until the last, I think it's number 85 Federalist paper, which he's writing this in the beginning of January 1788. That wouldn't be till August. And the Bill of Rights would be 2 years after this. So I got a little off topic with that because he continues to use the words well-regulated, 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 which is in the Second Amendment, which I'm pretty sure is the shortest amendment. And so I'm not arguing either way. I'm just trying to elaborate on the discussion they were having at the time. That being said, he is acknowledging here that a well-regulated militia is extremely important to the defense of the state. He just happens to be also arguing that militia should be controlled by the federal government so that it can defend itself from a standing army in the federal government. It's very strange, a little bit backwards. If you're new here, Wilbur, I don't remember your name being around before. Thank you for coming. If you get the time, if you missed any of the previous 3 or 4 Federalist papers, we do this every Tuesday, by the way, then you might want to pop back on some of those where Hamilton really outlines his argument for a standing army. I know it's hard for us to believe nowadays that many of the founding fathers were very much for a standing army. Alexander Hamilton was very much for a standing army. And as we've learned, he made some really interesting arguments for it. But I'm not going to get into that now. We have a lot more to get through on this one. Thus, differently from the adversaries of the proposed Constitution, should I reason on the same subject, deducing arguments of safety from the very sources which they represent as fraught with danger and perdition. So, the adversaries, as opposed to the Anti-Federalists, I look at this situation and see that the ability to control a well-regulated militia will bring safety to the people, as opposed to the Anti-Federalists who think the federal government having a control in the militia is dangerous. Oh, thank you, Wilbur. Well, I'm glad it's happening today. Yeah, I didn't want to watch either. But how the national legislature may reason on the point is a thing which will neither they nor I can foresee. Okay. So, Hamilton finding his out. For us historians who look back and look and say, well, maybe you're kind of an idiot sometimes. Sometimes, sorry, Hamiltonians. He's finding himself an out here by saying, but you know what? The Anti-Federalists think that federal control of the militias is going to be dangerous. I don't think so. But, what the federal government does in the future, I don't know. Maybe. Thanks, man. Thanks for really standing by your beliefs. There is something so far-fetched and so... man, I forgot. I didn't realize they used the phrase far-fetched back then. I just feel like that's a more modern term. Anyway. There is something so far-fetched and so extravagant in the idea of danger to liberty from the militia that one is at a loss whether to treat it with gravity or with raillery, whether to consider it as a mere trial of skill, like the paradoxes of rhetoricians, as a disingenuous artifice to install prejudice at any price, or as the serious offspring of political fanaticism. Again, Hamilton is writing propaganda. I know people hate it when I say that. He is writing propaganda. This sentence is talking trash about the Anti-Federalists, as always. The idea that militias are dangerous, that they won't protect your liberty instead of fight for your liberty. I don't know how you even take that seriously or if you get mad at the idea. It's crazy. It's crazy. And are you just doing it to make people angry at the Constitution, whether or not you believe what you're saying? Again, the Anti-Federalists, by and large, weren't against the militia. They just didn't want the federal government to control the militia. This is Hamilton taking an idea he's been discussing. He's been getting the reader riled up in his favor, and now he's going on the attack, as he does very frequently, against the Anti-Federalists by getting angry at an argument they're not even making. It's a very Hamilton way to go about things, if you think that kind of politics is new. And there's also something really great here. This is hilarious to me. The paradoxes of rhetoricians. So the questionable discussions of people who are very good at using flowery language. You know, like Alexander Hamilton. Whether or not you like him, he is certainly a rhetorician, whatever that is. Where I'm gonna take a sip of water so I stop laughing at myself. I'm just really funny when I make fun of Alexander Hamilton. I'm sorry. I like Hamilton in a lot of ways. He was a war hero, but I find myself hilarious from time to time. Where in the name of common sense are our fears to end if we may not trust our sons, our brothers, our neighbors, our fellow citizens? So he's going to go on one of his asking himself questions parades, as he likes to do. Where in common sense, why would you be afraid of the people in your militia? It's your family. It's you. You're a citizen of this nation. It is your duty, what they would at the time refer to as virtue, to get up and serve they'd use the word country, but your community, your town, your village. You sign up. And you think that you're the person that's going to do this? No. The militias are nothing to be afraid of, even if they have to follow rules sent down from the federal government and are totally under the control of the federal government. Hammy. Oh, Hammy. You know, for those of you who have only seen these videos, in the other videos about the American Revolution I make, I'm very good at keeping modern politics out of it. I assure you, the Federalist Papers are just particularly difficult. What shadow of danger can there be from men? Also, to be fair, every Friday I put out a video about the Anti-Federalist Papers. That's why I'm so torn on certain arguments. If you're not familiar, I have very much, as you can see, I spend time in both sides, so it's easy for me to talk trash about one or the other. What shadow of danger can there be from men who are daily mingling with the rest of their countrymen and who participate with them in the same feelings, sentiments, habits, and interests? Again, just asking himself the same question over and over again. Why would the militia do such bad things? Excuse me. What reasonable cause of apprehension can be inferred from a power in the Union to prescribe regulations for the militia, and to command its services when necessary, while the particular states are to have the sole and exclusive appointment of officers? So, what could you be afraid of? These are your neighbors. This is your community. It's your kids and your parents who are the ones in these militias. And we are even going to let the states appoint the officers. Yes, those officers have to follow the regulations of the federal government, but who cares? Why would you be afraid if the leaders are from your own community? Again, the Anti-Federalists wanted militias with the leaders appointed from their communities. They just also wanted the states in charge of those militias. If it were possible seriously to indulge a jealousy of the militia upon any conceivable establishment under the federal government, The circumstance of the officers being in the appointment of the states ought to at once extinguish it. So if you're afraid of anything, you got the officers, nothing to be afraid of anymore. There can be no doubt that this circumstance will always secure to them a preponderating influence over the militia. Oh, that sentence was going to be longer. There can be no doubt that this circumstance will always secure them. Okay, so the local powers that be will always have control of the militia because they have the officers, whether or not they're being instructed by the states or the federal government. In reading many of the publications against the Constitution, a man is apt to imagine that he is pursuing some ill-written tale or romance, which, instead of natural and agreeable images, exhibits to the mind nothing but frightful and distorted shapes. Gorgons, hydras, and the chimeras dire. I don't know why I put on that voice for that quote. Discoloring and disfiguring whatever it represents and transforming everything it touches into a monster. So the Anti-Federalists are literally picking apart every single piece of the Constitution, even the ones they agree with, and making arguments against it just to scare you out of it. It's not that scary. Calm down. He's going to give us examples. A sample of this is to be observed in the exaggerated and improbable suggestions which have taken place respecting the power of calling for the services of the militia. So let's go through some details. That of New Hampshire is to be marched to Georgia. Of Georgia to New Hampshire. Of New York to Kentucky, and Kentucky to Lake Champlain. So one of the Anti-Federalist arguments that he's representing here is the New York State militia is supposed to fight militia. Even during the American Revolution, like if you joined the Continental Army, they could send you anywhere. But if you joined your militia, if you were in Massachusetts and joined the Massachusetts militia, you could not be sent to New York or Connecticut or anywhere. Militiamen only had to fight in their state because the militia is only supposed to be a defensive body. And what they're saying here is if the federal government has the power to control the militia and they can do anything necessary and proper, why can't they take someone from my town and send me over, take someone from Massachusetts and send them down to Virginia to suppress the people of Virginia? Hamilton's going to say why that can't happen, I would presume. Nay, the debts due to the French and Dutch are to be paid in militiamen instead of Louis d'Ors and Duquesnes. So he's adding on to that. No. We're going to take you from Massachusetts and we're going to send you to France to help Napoleon fight. Well, 1788. Now the revolution hadn't broken out yet. Not a good reference. Forget I said that. But, we can't pay our debts to the Dutch. Can't pay our debts for fighting the war. We're going to take you from your house and send you overseas to fight. Let's see. At one moment, there is to be a large army to lay prostrate the liberties of the people. At another moment, the militia of Virginia are to be dragged from their homes 500 or 600 miles to tame the Republican contumacy of Massachusetts, and that of Massachusetts to be transported an equal distance to subdue the refractory haughtiness of the aristocratic Virginians. So he's being sarcastic here, saying, it's going to be one large army. It's going to stop all the people. But they're also just going to mix and match each different state. More or less repeating what he said. Do the persons who rave at this rate imagine that their art or eloquence can impose any conceits or absurdities upon the people of America for infallible truths? So stop being a hypocrite. Troy pointing out, New Hampshire to be marched to Georgia. Isn't that exactly what happened during the Whiskey Rebellion? No. Troy, I'm with you in sentiment. But I do believe the militias that were marched to the Whiskey Rebellion were Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, I think was the last one. So all the states that were marched to the Whiskey Rebellion were actually touching, physically borders touch Pennsylvania. So I'm with you in sentiment, Troy. That is more or less what happened. They did take militias from the other states. Well, it's funny. I was just reading about the Whiskey Rebels, but I didn't. I did it in passing, and I was refreshing myself on the Rebels, but I hadn't had the opportunity to refresh myself on the Army yet. George Washington was aware of this kind of thing. I believe that they called him in as an army. I should look this up, Troy. I will get back to you on this another time. Because but yeah, I believe that is essentially what happened. They called in militias, but I think they absorbed the militia into an American army for a moment there. That's why George Washington did it, and that's why Hamilton was able to lead, even though he was from New York, and Light Horse Harry Lee was from Virginia, but he was able to lead soldiers from other states. So again, with the sentiment, but I do think they like went around that through the appropriate means. Appropriate. Anyway, if there be an army to be made, oh, I went way too far. Way too far. Okay, so he's gonna ask himself some questions. I'm gonna take one more sip real quick. It's a longer paper than I realized. Excuse me. Thank you for sticking with me. If there should be an army to, my voice is done. Okay. I hadn't been speaking for about 2 weeks there. So if there should be an army to be made use of as the engine of despotism, what need of the militia? So if we're going to have a standing army that's you're so afraid of, why do we even need the militia? If there should be no army, whither would the militia, irritated by being called upon to undertake a distant and hopeless expedition, for the purpose of riveting the chains of slavery upon a part of their countrymen, direct their course, but to the seat of the tyrants, who had meditated so foolish as well as so wicked a project, to crush them in their imagined entrenchments of power, and to make them an example of the just vengeance of an abused and incensed people. So he's saying here, if there is no standing army, if you guys really don't want a standing army, why would you be afraid of the militia? Again, they're not afraid of the militia, but he is really just beating the reader down with this incorrect information, trying to get people to believe it. If the militia is called upon, why would the people of the militia, if they're regular people, agree to go and attack their countrymen in another state? Why would they want to fight for tyranny against another state? This and that. Why wouldn't they turn on the federal government and stop the people who are doing these terrible things? Again, as we said earlier, some people want to prove themselves. Also, he wants a well-regulated militia. A well-regulated militia would follow procedures. They're not just going to stop and say, no, let's just go to Washington instead of Virginia. Also, if one of the things Hamilton keeps talking about, and again, I'm bringing up anti-federalist points, but one of the things Hamilton keeps talking about is internal insurrection, and the need to be able to stop that. And if he is saying we're going to replace the standing army with the militia, but we need the federal government to be able to stop insurrections, well, if the people are being told, hey, look, what they're doing in Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts is horrifying and they're coming for you next, well, maybe the people of New York could be sold on that argument. I mean, it's a pretty easy question to answer, Hamilton. Maybe I'm an idiot. I don't know. Is this the way in which usurpers strive to dominion over numerous and enlightened nation? So is this how someone was going to take over the whole United States and suppress the people? Is this how they do it with the militia? No, it's with the standing army. That's why everyone's arguing. That's why you had to spend 5 papers on the standing army and just 1 on the militia. Do they begin by exciting the detestation of the very instruments of their intended usurpations? By exciting the detestations of the very instruments. I'm not sure which instruments he's referencing here. So, if someone wanted to suppress the whole of the United States, do they start by making people angry at the tools they use to do the suppressing? I'm not sure which tool he's referencing. If it's the militia, why make people mad at the militia? Or I guess it would be the army. Why, excuse me, why make people mad at the government itself? That's just a weird question. He loves hearing himself right. That's for sure. Do they usually commence their careers by wanted and disgraceful acts, disgustful acts of power, calculated to answer no end but to draw upon themselves universal hatred and execration? No, tyrants don't usually start by disgustful acts of power. They make their way there slowly. I mean, Most dictators of the 20th century took about a decade to get to dictator, are suppositions that the sober admonitions of discerning patriots to a discerning people. So would a reasonable person believe that they're just going to come out here and use the militia to do this? Or are they inflammatory, or are they the inflammatory ravings of incendiaries or distempered enthusiasts? So does anyone really believe this, or is it just the anti-federalists being duty faces? And I believe that's the 18th century phrase, is duty faces. And I'm trying to keep this a family channel when I use the phrase duty faces. If we were to even suppose that the national rulers actuated by the most ungovernable ambition, it is impossible to believe that they would employ such preposterous means to accomplish their designs. So, more or less, this, again, list of questions to himself, Hamilton is saying, if the federal government wants to suppress you, they're not going to use the militia. What are you so worried about? And again, I'll repeat that this entire paper is pointless, because none of the anti-federalists are saying there should be no militia. They just don't want to give the power of the militia to the federal government that also wants a standing army. They want to keep the power of the militia to themselves because of the standing army. In times of insurrection or invasion, it would be natural and proper that the militia of a neighboring state should be marched into another to resist a common enemy, or to guard the republic against the violence of faction and sedition. So there it is, Troy. He's saying right here what we were discussing earlier. It would be natural to use another state's militia to suppress a state if they have to, and they certainly consider the Whiskey Rebellion an insurrection, even though it really wasn't. This was frequently the case in respect to the first object in the course of the late war, and this mutual succor is, indeed, a principal end of our political association. So he's saying in the Revolutionary War, the militias of one state would be marched into the next state. But as I mentioned earlier, they legally couldn't, the soldiers, the militiamen did not have to go. Oftentimes, the state did what, it was called a levy, which is essentially rented out their militia to a neighboring state or to the Continental Army. Now, during the Revolutionary War, most of the soldiers, a gigantic portion of the militiamen, were fighting for the same cause. The thing about the Continental Army worked out so well because everyone was in it for the same reasons. So many people in one, look at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It happens in Massachusetts. You see Connecticut militiamen show up, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire militiamen show up. None of those people had to go. They all volunteered to be levied to Massachusetts and cross the line. That's why Artemus Ward takes over as the first commanding officer of this ragtag group, the Army of Observation, as it was usually called, because they were in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts state militia was in control, and the levied militias of the neighboring colonies at the time were essentially on loan. They were mercenaries, more or less. So he's acknowledging that this did happen frequently, but it didn't have to. And that's really important to remember, and he is not discussing that here. If the power of affording it be placed under the direction of the Union, there will be no danger of a supine and listless inattention to the dangers of a neighbor, till its near approach had superadded the incitements of self-preservation to the too feeble impulses of duty and sympathy. Publius. Really weird way to throw this out there at the end. He's saying, real quick at the end, if a neighboring state, if there's an insurrection in your state and your neighbor comes to help, well, that would be really nice of them to send over their militias to help your militia to suppress the insurrection. But if you're having an insurrection and your neighboring state comes over and they're not there to help, they're there to take your state, because states were very land hungry at the time, you are already in a bad situation and you are not prepared to defend yourself from your attacking neighboring state. But if we put it under the guise of the national government, well, the national government's not going to send another state at you. Well, they will help you suppress that insurrection, as we've been discussing. One of Hamilton's big things was suppressing insurrection. He keeps talking about it in these Anti-Federalist papers. But the federal government's not going to do anything wrong. They're going to send the neighbor to help, not to hurt. Publius. Troy coming in with one more question. Interesting he makes a distinction about using militias in a neighboring state. Yes. I'll bring myself up on the big board here. Yes, Troy, I absolutely agree. Oh, I guess I'm getting a little heated. I'm a little flushed. Look at that. Adorable. I forgot to turn the heater off before I started this, and I've been talking. Yeah, as we've said, anyone just joining us now, we just completed reading through Federalist number 29. It was a lot of fun. We're talking now about sending troops from neighboring states, as Troy had brought up earlier. Something the soldiers didn't have to do. In a militia, you did not have to cross lines until the national government took over and made some changes. You could see there, reflecting on our conversation earlier, Hamilton made some assumptions, and he presented them in a misleading way. This entire paper was presented very misleadingly, I will acknowledge. He was talking about posse comitatus, and which is calling out the posse for anyone who's joining late. Calling out the posse was something that the local sheriff was able to do, even back during the American Revolution, before the Wild West. And the idea was to call some militiamen out to enforce a local law. Additionally, the states could call in the militias if need be for various reasons. What Hamilton presents is that, hey, the Anti-Federalists are mad because the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to call out the posse. And it's like, no, the Constitution doesn't give the local sheriffs the right to do that. It does give it to the federal government. And he also then goes, like, most of the paper is on the militia and why the federal government, and he does have a point saying that the federal government would certainly be better at organizing the separate state militias, following all the same rules and regulations, in case we need to come together like we did during the Revolution to fight as one cohesive unit. That being said, he also says that the state militias, in case the standing army, you guys keep talking about how you're so scared of the standing army. Well, if things do go wrong with the standing army, well, we got the state militias. And it kind of ignores the idea that, yeah, but you're saying that the federal government should control those militias, making them essentially a subset of the same standing army. So why would the federal government turn the standing army on itself? And once again, I will remind you that the whole argument is pointless because none of the Anti-Federalists were saying we shouldn't have militias. They were just saying the states should continue to be in charge of the militias. We should not cede that power to the federal government. And it's one of the reasons, as I was saying earlier, we talked a little bit about the Second Amendment. One of the reasons the states pushed so hard for the Second Amendment was the well-regulated militia part. Now, I've heard arguments on both sides of the aisle that the right to bear arms is blanket for everyone, for any reason, at any time, which I think most Americans do agree with. But I have heard discussions about the well-regulated militia and how you only have the right to bear arms to have a well-regulated militia. No, I'm not coming down on either side of that right now. I do try and keep modern politics out of this. I'm sure some of you let me know in the comments how you feel. Or you think I'm an idiot just for mentioning that discussion. But no matter what you feel, the well-regulated militia part is important. That's why they put it there. Everything in the Bill of Rights is very important. And the idea that you need a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free people, right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It's the shortest Bill of Rights. and that's why Hamilton uses the phrase well-regulated militia over and over again in this discussion. And he's a guy who was against the Bill of Rights because it was so objectively necessary to the type of lives they lived at the time. That why the idea that he spends most of this paper implying that the Anti-Federalists don't even want a standing army is just hard to swallow. Anyway, Yellow, did Jefferson support a standing army? My understanding is Jefferson's opinions on everything changed over and over again throughout his life. He is one of the, well, I may disagree with Alexander Hamilton. He was extraordinarily on certain things. He was extraordinarily consistent. Thomas Jefferson was extraordinarily inconsistent. What fascinates me most about Thomas Jefferson is he represents both the best of what it means to be an American and the worst of what it means to be American, depending on the quote you're reading at the time. He is one of those really fascinating characters of history. I'm under the impression he certainly liked the Navy once he became president. Now, he did have certain qualms about the standing army. The Anti-Federalists, in large part, would end up becoming anti-administration party under George Washington, and then Democratic Republicans by the time Jefferson becomes president, aka Jeffersonian Republicans. So many of the people Jefferson associated with was super added week. Thanks, Troy. We learn a new word every week reading through these, don't we? So yeah, it's he was cautious about how he went about it. Jefferson was also a politician, and most of the people who were against the standing army in the first place ended up with his political party that he became a leader of. So he is cautious in those discussions. But I'm sure he has elaborated in places I'm not aware of. So I'm going to look into that for you, Yellow. Maybe we'll do a little addendum, a little discussion about it this week at some point. Speaking of which, before we go, I know people are going, trivia is going to be on Friday this week, because March is when my spouse travels a lot, so it's me with the kids, a lot of nights, so gonna have to do Friday. This weekend on Saturday, I am going to do the spies list. I promised. I found a lot more traitors than I anticipated. So we're going to be talking about America's favorite traitors during the Revolutionary War. And then, of course, if you want to support the channel, check us out on Patreon. We're going to do a live video, getting those going again, now that COVID's out of the house, on Sunday night. And we are going to be talking about the Lee family of Virginia, which is very exciting. That being said, Yellow, I do see you have another question here. Individuals bearing arms might be better to argue under the 9th and 10th Amendment. I mean, it specifically says it in the Second Amendment. I see where you're going with that, but it does very specifically say it in the Second Amendment. Because the 10th Amendment is what left everything not here is left up to the states. But again, it is very specifically there. Although I do like the 10th Amendment is, a lot of the Bill of Rights are very underappreciated. To be honest, we talk a lot about the First and Second Amendment, but we often ignore some of the other really important parts. Like, I'm a big fan of the Fourth Amendment and unwarranted search and seizure, as everything we do in our lives is monitored by our telephones in our pockets. Anyway, now that I've been eliminated, we don't talk about my politics. Sorry, I keep reading the comments here. Ninth Amendment is, why is the Ninth Amendment eluding me? You'd think I'd have them all memorized by now. I have most of them memorized. Ninth Amendment. No, not simplified. I just want to read it. Okay, pulling it up. Oh, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be denied, construed to deny or disparage. That's right. I forgot. How did I forget? This is one of my favorites. Construed to deny. This is another one of the short ones. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or to disparage others retained by the people. So you can't read the Bill of Rights and say, hey, it doesn't specifically say this here, so therefore you don't get it, right? Like, it says free. I'm trying to think of something stupid as an analogy here. Like, freedom of the press shall not be denied, but we can deny your ability to write by hand, because it doesn't say that you have the right to write letters. Freedom of the press, you need a printing press. You can print whatever you want, but to write or to type says nothing about sending emails in the First Amendment doesn't. That's where the Ninth Amendment comes in. No, it does. You know, that's the whole point. Speech, press, writing. Come on. Come on. That's essentially that's how I would translate the Ninth Amendment. Is Amendment number 9. Come on. All right. Well, a few more things coming in. I say that only if the Second Amendment was only for militia, the Ninth Amendment. That's a good point, Yellow. Yeah, you can't. That's a good point. That that some people might argue, hey, the 10th Amendment, the Second Amendment says right to bear arms for well-regulated militia, so you need a militia to bear arms. And it's like, well, no, the Ninth Amendment says, come on. I'm really proud of that translation of the Ninth Amendment. And yeah, the 10th Amendment, I'm pretty sure, is like anything not herein specifically stated is left to the states. The 10th Amendment is kind of a pointless amendment because the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution says, well, we can do whatever we want. So, and with that, if there's no other things that we are discussing today, a little bit of a longer video, hour 15. Whoa, it's 10:15 out here on the eastern half of the nation. Thank you guys for hanging out instead of watching the the State of the Union. I like to save modern politics for middle of the day. At night, I'll never fall asleep, and in the morning, it gets me too riled up for the day. I will only watch the news and learn about modern politics in the middle of the day. It helps me not be stressed out all the time. I recommend it if you're interested. That being said, I am going to go. That's about it for today. I hope you learned a little something. I learned some things. Great questions. I am going to look more into Jefferson's opinion on the standing army. Like, I know the answer to your question, but I haven't, like... I read a lot about Thomas Jefferson when I got into the American Revolution 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I know the answers in my head, but I want to double check with some of the text behind me before I get too into it. As always. Could these letters be like a template for or against the Second Amendment? I'm sorry, Wilbur. I'm not sure if there's a typo there. Could these letters be a template for or against the Second Amendment? I'm not sure what letters you're referencing. The Federalist Papers are... This one in particular, again, Hamilton didn't think there was a need for the federal... We're going to get there in about a year, because we only do these once a week. When we get to number 85, Hamilton talks about we don't need a Bill of Rights, because the states have Bills of Rights. So why does the federal government need one? To which the Anti-Federalists are like, because you say you get to do whatever you want. And they win. Objectively, if there's one argument Hamilton loses, it's the one he throws in at the end, the last paper, 85, we don't need a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists are like, yeah. Because even by then, the Constitution's been ratified by the time he even writes that. And most of the states are like, no, we're only going to accept this Constitution if you make these changes. And even like James Madison, who was also against the idea of a Bill of Rights, has changed his tune. Because James Madison wanted to be an inaugural senator for Virginia. I'm a father of the Constitution. Put me in. And Virginia went, no. So he said, okay, well, I'll run for House of Representatives. And he runs against future President James Monroe. And it's close. And he has to publicly acknowledge, okay, I'll write a Bill of Rights. And that's the only reason James Madison wins a very close race to the first U.S. House of Representatives against other future president and buddy of his, James Monroe. Because the people wanted a Bill of Rights. Because they were like, we're going to give you this ultra-powerful government, but you gotta do us this one little favor. And I'll leave you with a fun fact. The Bill of Rights was not 10 amendments. It was 12. 10 of them were passed. One of them was not. And one of them was tabled. And the 12th Amendment was just sitting around until 1992, when it was ratified just after Bill Clinton came into office, as the 27th Amendment is actually the 12th. But the 11th Bill of Rights, because it was the last one on the list of 12, 11 gets thrown out. So number 12 moves up to 11 and then waits to 27. It has to do with Congress paying itself. It wasn't until 1992 that Congress said, if we increase our own pay, that doesn't take effect until the people have the opportunity to elect us out. So, at least they did that in the 90s. With that, I'm out of here. You're welcome for the fun fact. I am your humble and obedient servant. As always, if you're new here, these live videos on the Federalist Papers every Tuesday. We do trivia, usually Thursdays. This week going to be on Friday. That's always a lot of fun. Make sure you hit like and subscribe for that. And we're doing a special event. We're talking about traders this weekend. That's going to be a good time. So look forward to that. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll be back with founders this week. Random founders. The primary core of my channel is short videos about American founders and trivia on Thursday. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much. And I will be back, not Thursday, usually Thursday. I will be back on Friday.